Hopefully get this thing set up.
I hope you know what you're doing now.
Oh, you know what you're doing, I'm just listening.
So I don't know what I'm doing. But play it by ear. I'll wear a canny, you've got earphones on.
I've seen that picture before behind you.
Like it. Josie painted that, by the way.
Aye. Was that not in a poster at one time?
Yes, it is. It's a front of Professor John's book as well.
That's what it was. Aye, that's what it is. Aye, aye.
It was on the banner and
So it was. Yeah, that's what it is. Aye, that's what it is. Aye.
Can I ask, what's the consensus? Do we wait a minute or two, or will we just start and anybody else, Sean, can...
Well, you're in charge, you make a decision. You've got the pause button, you can start. I think.
Would you reckon, Sean? Just start? Yeah.
There's quite a few people coming in now, Janice. That's about 15 in the last minute.
Okay. Let me know when you're all ready.
You start whenever you want, Janet, and I'll just keep admitting people as they join.
Okie doke. Well, good evening, folks. I'm Janet Cassidy, and I am a delegate on the Clydebank Trade Council. Looking at the pictures, most of us will remember the 71-72 Work-In, and it was the most successful political campaign of the post-war period. Now, we've got a few speakers. We've got David Torrance, who is a bankie, started work in, if I'm wrong, David, correct me, but I've been told that you started working back Clydecarroll Shipyard in 1953, and you've worked in most of all, if not all, of the yards in the Clyde. Davy was a leading steward in the Work-In as the staff side chair in Fairfields Yard, Govan. We have Mary Senior, another bankie. Previously has worked for the GMB in Unison, and now the senior official at UCU Scotland, and she's also this year's STUC's president. And Professor John Foster, who has been a leading academic in the Scottish trade union and labour movement for decades. He co-wrote the book, The Politics of the UCS Work-In, and was allowed exclusive access to the shop steward meetings and to record them. What I plan to do is give them each 15 minutes each. And then if there's a question session, for those that aren't too up on the technology, I'll try and explain it. At the bottom of your screen, you should see participants. If you click onto that, and in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a bit raise hand. I can ask you to use that, and I should be able to see who's wanting questions. You having problems there, David? So is everybody quite happy with that? So I'm going to mute myself and give the floor, so to speak, to David.
Can you hear me?
Carry on.
Can you hear me, Sean? Aye?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. What I'm going to do, Janet, evening all. Before you can work out what happened to Upper Clyde Work-In, you've got to understand what happened from the beginning. So give a wee brief thorough through about 15 minutes up to the time we actually were consolidating the position. Then I'll take it and then we can open it up. Okay, is that all right? Aye?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll start. My name's David Torrance. I'm 83 years of age. I'm a shipyard draftsman to trade. And I worked in the yards when I was 15, I was 65, except for 2 years in the British Army. At the time when I was working, I was the chairman of the UCS, the Fairfields Joint Technical and Clerical Staff. And a member of the coordinating committee when it was set up. Before the working started, I think it's very important to understand the trade union organisation in the shipyards. Every single person in Fairfields, without exception, was in their respective trade union. All staff, all manual workers were under a joint shop stewards committee, so that was a key element. This was the same in all the other yards, so in the yard you had a unity of the workers. So the yards are a very strong and experienced bunch of shop stewards used to organising and fighting the bosses, which I think was one of the key ways to win the struggle, a key thing is. Wee bit of history to let us see how it all happened. In '64, the Labour government was elected, and the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions recommended the public ownership of the shipbuilding and engineering the industry. Harold Wilson rejected that. In 1966, the Labour government set up a Fairfield experiment, which they helped to improve labour relations in the yards, and they set up shop stewards going to courses and things like that. So they were trying to change us a wee bit, I think. Then beginning in 1968, the Upper Clyde shipyards were set up. Alexander Stevens and Lindhouse, Fairfields and Govan, Charlie Connells and Scots, and John Burns and Clydebank and Yarrows. But they excluded Clydeholm Bartley's yard, which was owned by Swan Hunter. Now, I think this is quite important. Bartley's had just been modernised at a cost of millions of pounds. So it was the most modern yard on the Clyde at the time. But it was demolished in an act of industrial vandalism by Swan Hunter. If we had demolished Bartley Culls ourselves, we'd get to jail. So the Upper Clyde shipyards, I think, was set up to fail. Tories were elected in 1970. On the 4th of February 1971, Rolls-Royce went into liquidation and the Tories nationalised them. On the 11th of February 1971, John Davis removed Yarrows for UCS and stated no more public money for UCS. The death sentence on the UCS had been declared, but it had to be delayed because Ted Heath couldn't fight in two fronts at one time, Rolls-Royce and UCS. So the spring of 1971 onwards saw us organising our defences, setting up joint shop stewards committee covering our 4 yards, which became the coordinating committee, raising the issues at the STUC annual conference at Easter and other made trade union conferences throughout the country. Meanwhile, we sent shop stewards to all the meetings and demonstrations organised by a liaison committee for the defence of unions and speakers to Communist and Labour Party branches, trade union branches, church groups and trades councils. A popular alliance was being created. It was a very, very important week. Friday, the 11th of June, the conveners met the UCS chairman, Tony Hepper, who told them it looked like liquidation. On the Saturday, the 12th of June, the conveners met and agreed to recommend a takeover of all the yards, but to continue to work, and we agreed a 50p levy. Sunday, the 13th of June, all shop stewards met in the 4 yards, and the proposals were put to mass meetings which for the 4 yards in the Monday morning. So on Monday, the 14th of June, in the morning, a mass meeting in the 4 yards, shop stewards proposals agreed. Monday, the 14th of June, in the afternoon, Sir John Davis, Secretary of State for Industry, declares UCS bankrupt and appoints a liquidator, Courtney Smith. Monday, the 14th of June, the same day, evening, public meeting in Clydebank Town Hall. Provost Bob Fleming, Tony Ben, Shadow Secretary of State for Industry, and many others from the STUC, and Jimmy Early and Jimmy Reid addressed the meeting. It was agreed to organise 2 trains paid for by Clydebank Council from a common good fund to travel all night on the Tuesday to Logway Parliament on Wednesday, the 16th of June. Tuesday, the 15th of June, STUC General Council met and gave full support. The 2 trains were filled and a successful lobby took place with 1,000 workers marching onto the Parliament in London, where the conveners and the Provost of Clydebank met 10 Heath. The following week, 21st of June, a meeting was held in a Roseville Bank Hall, attended by 800 shop stewards from all over the west of Scotland. They agreed to call a stoppage and demonstration through Glasgow on Wednesday, the 23rd of June. Also that day, the Glasgow Council agreed to support the fight to save the yards and also a meeting of the local church leaders pledged their support. Wednesday, 23rd of June, 150,000 workers stopped and 50,000 marched through Glasgow to Glasgow Green. From that successful day, stewards were sent all over the country to speak to various meetings. Monday, the 30th of July, while the Glasgow Yards, Govan, Scotston and Lintners were on holiday, the government thought that they picked the right time. The first redundancies were announced in Clydebank, so a mass meeting was called and the work-in begins. This is a meeting where the liquidator, Courtney Smith, had barred the press from coming in, but the sharpshooters took over the gates and allowed them in to record the meeting. This was a very key moment. It showed that the workers were now in control of the yard. Allowing the press in opened up the struggle to a much wider audience. And here Jimmy Reid make it famous, there'll be no vandalism, no revving speech. We are now on the world stage. Whilst this was going on in Clydebank, myself and my mate Jimmy Clothley and our wives were on a campsite just outside Saint-Tropez in the south of France. We heard the news on the BBC overseas radio, and me and Jimmy says, we're going back, but our wife says, you're not on. So we did best thing and went to Nice and met representatives of the French Communist Party and lobbied them for support. A month later, we received £1,000 from the CTG union in Nice. After Jimmy's speech went viral, messages of solidarity and financial support started flowing. All the main unions officially agreed to pay dispute benefit to all members declared redundant and remain within the work-in, and no one was made compulsory redundant. Financial support came from all over now: Rolls-Royce, Singers, Chrysler, Ravenscraig, Lower Reach Shipyards, Camel Airs, Bagland Bay Refinery, Vickers and the Miners, 3 Soviet shipyards and a Dutch shipyard, and not forgetting a bunch of red roses and £1,000 from John and Yoko. When the other yards came back from holiday, we had meetings and agreed to follow the Clydebank yard. 10th of August, we had another meeting in the Roseville Bingo Hall. This time 1,200 shop stewards gathered, and a stoppage and demonstration was called for the 18th of August. The 16th of August, STUC held a special congress for the first time ever with all the main British trade union leaders present, and Jimmy Reid was allowed to speak. All unions now in support, unity of the working class at the highest level secured. 18th August, mass demo, 200,000 people stopped. 80,000 men, women and children marched from George Square to Glasgow Green. Now, the significance of this demo was not lost in the government. The platform of speakers were a public manifestation of the unity that had been created, which included Jimmy Reid, Jimmy Haley, Vic Ferrer for the TUC, Danny McGav for the Boilermaker, Suez Cannon Engineers, Alec Murray, Communist Party, Jimmy Jack, STUC, William Youth, Scottish National Party, Tony Benn and Miller Ross from the Labour Party. A popular alliance front had been formed. The next component of it, in the fight was the STUC special inquiry, held from the 1st of September and the week preceding the 2 Easter. The character of the evidence presented and the professional standing of the committee enabled the stewards to continue to capture the front pages of the press at just those moments when the government most needed to convince Scottish Pigeon there was no alternative to their proposals. When Jimmy Reid gave his evidence on behalf of the coordinating committee, he threw into the proceedings the time bomb, which the stewards had been carefully harbouring for the last couple of months. The forces that copies of the original unpublished Ridley report. The worst proof that liquidation was a result of prior government policy. The Ridley report was presented to the inquiry. The main points of this shocking indictment of Tories being no more public money to UCS, yet let the arrow leave the UCS, put in a government butcher to cut up UCS and sell cheaply the assets of UCS to lower Clyde and others. After liquidation as above, we shall sell the government holders even for a pittance. Even the Daily Record published a report in a full under the banner headline, bloody butchering. The struggle lasted for another year until September 1972, when government shipbuilders were set up and marathon was set up at Clydebank, and ended in the victory for the workers and all who supported us. Moving on to the present, I think it's important. Now 50 years on, Govan and yards are still open, employing just under 2,000 workers and supporting a further 2,000 in the supply chain with the work for the next decade. They have taken on around 100 new apprentices this year. They also have designed contracts for 15 ships to be built in Canada and 9 ships to be built in Australia. So the last 50 years have been exciting. The years have been merged, bankrupted, liquidated, occupied, saved, nationalised, privatised, sold off to Caverna and sold off to BAE Systems. I'd like to end my contribution at the moment to sing the last verse of an Arthur Johnson poet song. Excuse the tune. As I look back through the years to the changes we have seen, they're building all the uppy flats on the way to Glasgow Green, but the government lads are working on, and yeah, it seems all right, but hate to see what might have been if we hadn't put up a fight. Thank you. Over and out.
Well done, Davy.
Okay.
What an insight. I mean, I moved out of Clydebank in 1971 when I got married, moved out to the east. But that was days when it seemed easier for trade unionists compared to today's.
No, it was. We were better organised then.
Right, Mary.
Okay, thanks very much, Janet, and thank you to Clydebank Trades Council for organising this evening's meeting. I think it's so fitting that as the local Trades Council, we're commemorating this real tremendous victory for working people as we approach the 50th anniversary of the UCS Work-In. And I'm really honoured to be here as the STUC president on this eminent panel. First, I just wanted to refer to another landmark anniversary this month for Clydebank, as this weekend marks the 80th anniversary since the Clydebank Blitz. 1,200 people lost their lives, 1,000 more were injured, and thousands of people were made homeless when Hitler's Nazi bombers tried to destroy our town in the name of fascism. And regrettably, due to the pandemic, the commemorations for this important anniversary are not going to take place until October, but I think it's really important that we do acknowledge that anniversary and that we renew our pledge to combat racism, fascism and xenophobia wherever and whenever it raises its head. So I encourage everybody to support the UN Day Against Racism, which is on Saturday the 20th of March, and there's a number of Stand Up to Racism online events that day. So please do support that, as well as the Clydebank commemorations in October. Now, I've been asked to talk about the STUC's role 50 years ago, back in 1971 and 72. And as I wasn't around then, I've had to rely on, actually, I think a lot of it is some of the work, the good work that John Foster's done, but also I need to thank the STUC's Francis Stewart, who dug out some of the notes and stuff, because it hasn't been as easy to access the STUC's archives in these pandemic times. So just to say, a lot of what I'm going to say comes from Francis and of course from John. And I think no doubt, as John will outline, the unity and the effective strategising of the UCS Shop Stewards Committee was so important to the success of their action. And I think the central pillar of their strategy was that of presenting the dispute as one which united not just the workers in the 4 Upper Clyde shipyards, but that united workers across the west of Scotland, but indeed the whole of Scotland and the UK. This was really about the working classes truly united against faceless ministers and bureaucrats all the way down in Westminster, who were in cahoots with big business, and they were taking away their work. And so to realise this workers' united message, I think the role of the STUC in supporting the UCS workers and sustaining them through the dispute was really crucial. And then I think the other fundamental part of the dispute, which ensured it was so compelling and persuasive, was the very nature of the work-in. It was really the manifestation of the right to work, a peaceful, dignified and positive protest, which highlighted that the ability to engage in meaningful labour as a basic and fundamental human right And we really do need to commend the brilliance of the UCS conveners for conceptualising and delivering that work-in as such a powerful tactic. Now, the STUC had been involved in previous campaigns by shipyard workers, including the attack on unions in Aberdeen in 1967. And as Davey said, the UCS consortium was brought about by the workers' struggle, and the STUC had supported industrial action there prior to the 1970s. And I think the UCS workers already had good links with the STUC. Shipyard workers and their unions had representation on the STUC's key committees, including the Engineers Union, whose regional officer and the rep from the shipyard sat on the STUC General Council's Economic Committee. So they were in touch with the STUC as soon as management informed workers of the plans to close the yards, and the STUC stayed in close contact with UCS Shop Stewards Coordinating Committee throughout the dispute. And I think the strong communication channels meant that on the 14th of June, the day of the ministerial announcement on liquidation, the STUC immediately declared its support for the work-in, and the close working and the formidable strategising of the union conveners enabled them to be a step ahead of government, particularly in those first important weeks in the summer of 1971. And I think when we talk about the STUC and the role, it's important to remember that the STUC is a movement comprised of its affiliated organisations representing working people and their families. And the STUC draws its power and legitimacy from the membership and representation of workers. And so, it's always been ready to provide practical support to affiliates and their members. But I think there's no doubt that the close political alignment of many of the STUC leaders at the time and those leading the UCS dispute really helped that close working. The Communist Party membership of the key protagonists, Sammy Barr, Jimmy Reid, Jim Airlie, along with having a Communist Party branch in the shipyards, would have meant that the UCS workers' leaders had confidence in some of those STUC players who shared their Communist Party membership, such as Jimmy Milne, the STUC's Assistant General Secretary and a past president of the STUC. I think this would have helped to build the trusting relationships and avoid any of the suspicions that were aroused by some of the other union leaders of the time, who were perceived by some as being on the right of the movement and perhaps too ready to do deals with government. So I think the inspiring and mobilising leadership of the UCS shop stewards is well known. The STUC backed the Glasgow demonstration on the 23rd of June 1971, and I think thinking back, it really emphasises the phenomenal organising skills in a time before social media, before mobile phones, that 9 days after the government announcement, UCS workers and the STUC were able to get 50,000 people to march on Glasgow Green. It's really a tremendous achievement. And the fact that the STUC chose Jimmy Milne as its speaker there, the former shipyard convener from Aberdeen, I think this played well to the mass audience and underlined the STUC support for the UCS fight. I suppose this also underpinned that general solidarity, uniting working people for that simple goal of their dispute, the right to work. And at key points during the long dispute, the STUC representatives met with UK ministers, but they also attended mass meetings with the workers direct. And I think a key lesson of UCS is surely around workers' grassroots shop floor democracy, and the STUC, along with the trade union leaders, were very much accountable to the workers themselves. One of the other important elements of the STUC's role, and again Davey mentioned this, was the establishment of a committee of inquiry into the rundown of the Upper Clyde shipbuilders. And I think this approach, bringing together trade unions, academics, local business leaders, to participate in a rational and evidence-based inquiry to investigate the issues and propose solutions was really an astute way forward. It helped to expose the divisions in the Tory government's failings, and it helped to sort of show the divisions amongst businesses and employers, and to build a consensus for the objectives of supporting all 4 UCS yards. The STUC's Committee of Inquiry took evidence from the workers, from employers, academics, local communities. It held its first meeting in Clydebank. So, you know, really showing it was sort of embedded in the local community, which contrasted so starkly with the Westminster government, you know, hundreds of miles away. And this consensus building Civic Scotland carefully considered approach used by the STUC in 1971 for UCS was then replicated later on such important issues as the Constitution. You know, it paved the way for Scotland's Constitutional Convention, which ultimately delivered the Scottish Parliament. And in the early 70s, it certainly galvanised that broad coalition supporting UCS workers. It's just so important. And I think, you know, this approach, which was just steeped in local communities involving the churches, the Church of Scotland, the Catholic Church, local authorities, you know, such a strong, solid, widespread and diverse communities of support for UCS, which it was an alliance that was too fierce for London ministers to counter. And thinking about Jimmy Reid's successful election as Glasgow University rector in early 1972 and his seminal rectoral address, I think this really underlined that this was more than a local dispute. It was an influential, principled movement, widely supported and respected across society. Now, John Foster is going to cover the lessons for our movement. But just to briefly touch on them, you know, the strategizing and tactics was just so spot on. The Work-In was the perfect concept to deflect any suggestions of trade unionists being shirkers or work shy, and it cemented that campaign goal of the right to work. I don't think it's the easiest tactic to replicate elsewhere, although, you know, other unions definitely try to do it, not least my own union, the University and College Union, with the teachings that UCU members have delivered during periods of industrial action. Not that we can match the force of the shipbuilders in the 70s, but I think it does encourage us to consider creative outcomes, and unions certainly do that, thinking of some of the Better Than Zero or the Unite Hospitality branch with their very creative stuff around flash mobs and the action short of strike that we can do. I think, you know, the communication, the messaging and the immediacy of what the workers were able to take forward, as well as the discipline. And, you know, it's been well documented in Jimmy Reid's sort of no bevying and just the manner in terms of how this was carried out. But, you know, this was very much more than a local industrial dispute. It was presented as, and it absolutely became about community, about class, about workers and their families as a whole. And we have to thank the UCS conveners for characterising it as such. And I think that community organising, the whole person approach, that it's not just a worker, it's the family, it's their lives. Again, I think some of that is replicated today in some of the Jane McAlevey, the strike school organising that we see, which looks at the whole person, not just the workplaces, which is incredibly important. And thinking about that, I wanted to, I suppose, end with a comment from Jimmy Reid, and this is really from his rectoral address. And he said, government by the people, for the people becomes meaningless unless it includes major economic decision-making by the people, for the people. This is not simply an economic matter. In essence, it's an ethical and a moral question for whoever takes the important economic decisions in society, ipso facto determines the social priorities of that society. And I think that really summarises how UCS became political, economic and social and was so powerful. And the government and employers could not ignore workers and the trade unions. So it really was a momentous victory for the movement, a victory for the UCS workers and reps, and a victory for working class people. So it really has been a tremendous legacy for the movement and for Scotland, and it's absolutely fitting that we're commemorating it and debating it still today. So thanks, Janet.
Thanks very much, Mary, for your contribution from the STUC side of it, and knowing that you're a bit on the young side, that you weren't here at the time. I only remember it because I was a teenager at the time. Right, I shall hand over to John now.
Well, congratulations to the Clydebank Trade Union Council for putting on this meeting, and congratulations to Davy, who's got an amazing memory and a very analytical one, and I know that was very important at the time in terms of the discussions and debates about strategy and tactics. And thanks again to Mary, because she really does bring forward the role of the STUC at the time. It was central, and I'll say one or two words about that, in winning wider solidarity, and also bringing forward the tradition of the STUC as being one that was significantly different from that of the British TUC. It was set up, in fact, I think if my memory is right, by trade union councils, or trades councils as they were then, when they'd been thrown out of the British TUC for being too socialist and radical. And that's why you had commitments about socialism in the original STUC constitution. So Mary really did carry that forward. As has been said, I want to focus on what we can learn today, and I think that is the best way of paying tribute to the struggles of the shop stewards, of Davy and the others, some of whom are here, and focus on three things. First, the importance of having a strategy and what a strategy means. Secondly, about developing tactics that can carry it through, that are flexible and creative and can be changed in terms of how events materialize. And third, and I think this is the thing I really want to stress, understanding particular struggles in their relations to others, their connections with what was happening elsewhere. And I think Mick McGackie made that point. The labour movement is not a monument, but it is indeed a movement. It is continually changing and it interacts crucially. So to start with the strategy and tactics, and then go on to concentrate on the issue of interconnections and relations and links. So what does having a strategy mean for the trade union movement? I would have thought it means knowing that any collective action by workers challenges the assumptions of the kind of society in which we live today. A free market society, as it's called. It's not a free market at all. A capitalist society, you could call it more directly. And it will be resisted, and it's knowing how, on the basis of past experience, to counter this. And the UCS was indeed marked out as being led by those who had that kind of a perspective. It wasn't unique. I think you could say that in the miners, Mick McGackie had that perspective. There were some people inside some of the engineering disputes that took place in Scotland, but it was fairly unique among disputes. And the leading stewards themselves, communists and left Labour, they did see themselves as carrying forward a tradition of resistance, going back to the Red Clyde side, that our society is indeed a class society. It's controlled by those who own capital, and it's structured to exploit those who don't have it. But also one, and this was crucial to the development of the strategy, a society with its contradictions. And in our era, between big business, the monopolies, and the rest, and how these contradictions could be exploited. And they did use the term. They didn't use the term, we're going to develop an anti-monopoly alliance when addressing workers in the yard. Had they done so, I think they might have been shouted down. But in the discussions that took place behind the scenes and elsewhere, those are precisely the words that were used to try and seek out the weaknesses in the position of the government. And they also analysed how the ruling class ruled in terms of penetrating all aspects of society with its ideas, including in terms of attitudes and assumptions, the trade union and labour movement. And those will be very powerful. And I think, unfortunately, we can see them in many aspects today. And it was from that analysis of these contradictions, on the one side, the contradictions within the ruling class, among the owners of capital, and on the other, the penetration of the ideas of the establishment into the working class movement itself, that the two tactics came. First, the tactic of the work in itself. And that was essentially to keep control of the struggle in the hands of the shop stewards and to keep the workforce united. Those two things went together. All 4 yards, all the workers, and a principle that bound them, as both Davy and Mary have said, the right to work, knowing that there were others there who would want to take over the bargaining, and the framework within which most trade union leaders worked. And they worked, in a sense, seeing it as the best thing to do within existing assumptions, to get as many jobs saved as they could, to compromise, to bargain. But in doing so, in those circumstances, certainly in the way that Feather and McGarry would have done it, and we knew what they were after and what they were trying to do and what the government was trying to force them to do across the summer of 1971, it would have divided the workforce and surrendered the principle of the right to work. And that was, of course, not just important inside the yards, but outside. It would have been one more defeat, one more closure after a long line of closures of shipyards and workplaces on the Clyde that I think Davy has already listed. And that slogan, the right to work, was what gave the UCS a resonance across Britain. It matched the events of the time, because that was a period of a key turning point. It was the first attempt by a Conservative government to turn the clock back before the Second World War to the 1930s, to abandon the post-war consensus, one won by the struggles of workers, about full employment and a welfare state. That was what that government intended to do, to reintroduce the kind of neoliberal policies that were ultimately not introduced until 10 years later. So that was one key part of the tactic. It was to keep control of the yards, to keep control of unity, to keep workers united, and to keep bargaining in the hands of the shop stewards who had a strategy, who knew the weaknesses of the government's position. And that's the second tactic, building wider alliances. We've heard about this from both Mary and Davy. Understanding that there were conflicts among the employers themselves. You had the big British multinationals who were basically the people that the Heath government wanted to promote and develop in terms of their ability to access labour, cheap labour as far as possible across the regions of Britain. Then you had the Clydeside shipbuilding barons who had their own agenda, Mr. Yarrow and Mr. Lithgow. Then you had the United States branch plants who were coming in with productivity bargaining, who had their own separate agenda as well. And then you had many, many small supply firms. And I think, as Davy would have been able to tell you, 70% at least of a ship was always built outside the yard and brought in. And those were the smaller firms that provided those components, and all had conflicted interests, and the stewards knew that. Many of those smaller suppliers were threatened with bankruptcy themselves. Second, there was an understanding of how the Conservative Party exercised its political influence. And it's important to kind of think back, but in that period, Castle Milk, a working class housing estate, had a Tory MP. Not long before, Craigton had a Tory MP. The West End of Glasgow had a Tory MP, perhaps more understandable, but there were lots of them, and they had a base within the working class. And it was very important to be able to penetrate and break open that base. And that was the tactic: expose these divisions, get the employers themselves to speak out against each other, expose the plans of Yarrow and Lithgow, as both Mary and Davy said, to use the fear of unemployment and, as was put very explicitly in Mr. Ridley's leaked memorandum, cut the cancer of the UCS out of the Clyde and bring back labour discipline. I think that was actually a quote, probably either from Mr. Yarrow or from Lithgow. I think it was probably Lithgow who said it. Yeah, Lithgow. Jointly with the STUC, it was the stewards who organised that September public inquiry, and it was a very imaginative thing to do, to bring together the chambers of commerce, employers, some of the American employers. Somebody from Ford came along because they all had conflicting views and they were willing to speak them out because they, well, I wouldn't say they hated each other, but they didn't like each other. They had different policies. They drew on that. And then, of course, amplified this with the Scottish Assembly of February 1972, which represented all sections of Scottish society having been rallied around this concept of the right to work and everything it represented for Scotland at that time against what the government was seen to be trying to do. Local government, again, rallied against premature neoliberalism, the political parties and businesses. And you had Jimmy Jack there as, I don't think, was he chairing? I can't remember. Davey would know that. I remember being there, but I can't remember. But I remember his speech when he said, "We need a Scottish Parliament, and wait for it. It will be a workers' parliament. It will have the support of other sections of society. It will have small employers, professions, the churches, but it will be a workers' parliament." So that, again, further isolated the government. And that was seen consciously as building this broad anti-monopoly alliance based on a class Marxist analysis of the nature of society. And the result of that strategy and tactics was it united people across Britain on the right to work and divided and broke away, in terms of the Progressive Party, the political base of Conservatives. And that is exactly how Heath and his cabinet saw it. We can now go into the cabinet papers. And in September 71, which was the end of it, was the turning point, really. That's the time when they capitulated another yard, but basically they realized they were gutted, they were defeated. And Heath says that it was the workers of the UCS who had turned the corner against them, who had turned that TUC in September against them, had won the argument against them on the Industrial Relations Act. And that was the key thing they needed to get through. It had turned the argument. The big unions weren't going to wear it anymore. And they had to change tactics. And he prepared to sack two of the most emblematic of those right-wing ministers, Eden and Ridley. So that brings us to the third point. I won't use too much time. And I think it's important, possibly the most important thing to understand about the UCS, its relationship to other struggles, and seeing the interconnections. Remembering the UCS stewards didn't come out of nowhere. They were all relatively young. I think even David was quite young then, quite young.
33.
All relative, which is young, looking back. Some graduated through the apprentices' strikes of the 1950s, which were all British. Others through the redevelopment of the national shop stewards movement that really only took off in the 1960s with the creation of combine committees within the big motor complexes that were being constructed then to try and get into cheap regional labour as the big bosses saw it from London, and the creation of all British shop stewards combine committees. Those are all things that happened over the previous decade, crucially important, but the UCS stewards came out of that movement and the understanding that came with it. And it has to be said that the STUC support didn't come out of nowhere either. It did, as Mary said, and she did detail it, great effectiveness, a critical role. But it would not have acted as strategically and supportively just 10 years before. It depended on the transformation at British level of the Transport and General Workers Union as a left union in the 1960s, of the miners over the same period. Previously, both those unions had been under quite right-wing control. The transformation of the engineers, that wasn't quite as solid, but it was important. And certainly in the west of Scotland, the left was in control. And also the role of trades councils, as Mary talked about it. There was a revival of trades councils in that period, and Jimmy Milne, of course, was from Aberdeen. And then also the development of shop stewards committees across Scotland. The kind of leadership and character of those shop stewards committees had matured and developed during that previous decade. And in particular, over the previous 5 years, there was the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions, which was set up in 1966 and saw its role as bringing together trade unions, but levels of shop stewards, but district committees and regional committees across Britain in a broad alliance to defend the rights of trade unions, knowing that both the Labour government and the Tory government would be attacking them. And it was the Liaison Committee that initiated the first nationwide political strikes in 1969 against in place of strife. And that, of course, provided the precedent for the political solidarity strikes for UCS. There had been further strikes against the Tory legislation in, I think, March 1971. And then in the summer of 71, you had that great strike, or two great strikes that took place in Scotland and mobilized the mass demonstrations. So these were the connections that created the basis for that fight back. It's difficult to see that it would have happened without all those other developments. And I think we should probably also mention the role of the Morning Star as a daily paper, because it was in some ways the lifeblood that connected all those struggles, showed the lessons after each battle. And I have to say, at the moment, I can see Jim marked somewhere in the screen here. I and Jim and a number of others on the screen are currently involved in writing a history. Hugh McGuinness, I can see there, a history of the Transport and General Workers Union. So I've been going around talking to people in various parts of the country who remember that period. They're all pretty old now. London dockers, Merseyside car workers, people at Longbridge, and they remember Airlie coming down, speaking at the Royal Docks in London. They remember Airlie coming down to Merseyside to speak to the car workers, Reid at Longbridge. I think from some description, they also remembered Davy Torrance as well. And I'm sure Davy Torrance was out.
Vickers at Barrenfurnace.
That's right. So there is that memory. And it is very important that it was seen as an all British movement. And there would not have been a U-turn by Heath in 1971 if there hadn't been that interaction with the fight against the Industrial Relations Act and if Heath hadn't seen his whole legislative programme slowly slipping away from under him. So just end by stressing the significance of the UCS for the balance of what happened of the class forces across Britain in the subsequent few years. The dominant group within the Tory party wanted a Thatcherite revolution a decade before Thatcher. They were defeated. But more important than that was the change of balance within the trade union and labour movement, and consequently within the Labour Party itself. This all happened very quickly in the following 2 or 3 years. The consequence of the defeat of the Industrial Relations Act, the lessons of the struggle for the right to work, the 100 other occupations that took place up and down the country in the following 12 months, supported by community movements, deeply entrenched in community support, with action committees being set up to maintain those actions, and also, and initially, of course, to maintain the flow of funds into the UCS. That changed the balance, and it changed the ideas. You had the rise of Tony Benn, a new type of Tony Benn compared to what the Wedgwood Benn was in the 1960s. Not a technocrat, but somebody who believed in the power of the workers because he'd seen it and experienced it. And that's what changed the balance inside the Labour Party, at least temporarily, so that its manifesto, framed in 1973, talked about it. And it's difficult to almost believe now. They called for an irreversible shift of wealth and power in favour of working people. So it's important to see the UCS as part of a movement integrated into trade unions, shop stewards across the whole of Britain, drawing its strength from it and giving it strength, and being therefore a movement and not a monument, as McGahey always used to say. And just to, I think, pick up the point that Mary Senior made, changing the assumptions about what democracy is about. For working people, democracy is not just a matter of putting a cross on a piece of paper. It's a matter of economic democracy, of being able to control how investment is made and who it's made for, who produces, for what. And that was, I think, the crucial lesson of the great work-in for the right to work. It was that understanding that there should be an economic democracy for working people, and the political measures needed to bring it about.
Thank you, John. Quite in depth. I feel now that I need to go and try and get a copy of the book.
I'll get you a copy, don't worry. Worth reading.
Thanks a lot, Davey. Right, I'm going to open it up to everyone else, but can I ask you again to use the electronic hand, because there's 4 pages here and it just makes it a wee bit easier to see. I see so far John Swinburne and Tommy Morrison. So John first and then Thomas. John, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I've got the unmute class. I've overcome my lack of technological expertise. I remember as a school student attending.
Sorry, John, can you turn your volume up a wee bit?
Can't hear him.
No. I remember as a school student attending a huge demonstration in Glasgow on the scope of UCS workers with a school parliament, and I think we were in S4 or S5 at the time, and it was just breathtaking. The number of people, the number of trade union banners, the number of red flags, it was inspiring. And I ended up, my hometown in Motherwell, who were steel workers and their families, and they were chanting, if I remember correctly, Clydebank Steel for UCS, and they were determined, and they were showing class solidarity, and they never. And I think what I grew from it all, led me to join Young Communist League and my school pal as well, and I think also that looking at it in terms of my hometown, Motherwell, the steel industry, what happened to that? And did we have shop stewards in the steel industry in Motherwell who were like-minded, who were of a perspective which understood that compromising all the time with the capitalists, negotiating what was thought to be the best possible deal, was not the way forward. Well, to be honest, see my hometown of Motherwell now, it's a desert. It's an industrial desert. It's a mess. And I think that answers the question itself. I have a question to the panel. Sorry, I get carried away a bit thinking about UCS. I've got a question for the panel, which is, when I think about the great strike in the miners in 1984, it seems to me that women played a central role in women's support groups, working women, women in miners' families. And that's not something that to me was so evident in UCS. I wonder if anybody can cast a light on the role of women, working women, and how they supported that struggle. Thanks.
Right, thanks for that, John. So your question is about the women's participation in it. Am I right there?
Aye.
Right, Tommy.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks to the three speakers. I thought that was a brilliant introduction from the three speakers. So that's a couple of questions I got. I was going to ask about what John raised about Jimmy Jack in '72 when he said a Scottish Parliament would be a workers' parliament. Yeah, when you look what we had and what's turned out to be, it's really a kind of managerial parliament. They've just carried out the cuts of the Tories and right-wing Labour. So what's the chances that we could actually get a parliament which acts in the interest of the working class? And my second question is really on developing class consciousness and indeed political consciousness that the leading stewards had, and which was so important to win that dispute. 2 years ago, in 2019, Clydebank Trade Union Council had a motion to the STUC calling for STC and its affiliates to launch a campaign of political education to its members. And I'm just wondering what's the chances of that actually happening, because it's desperately needed now to raise a whole political level across Scotland and across the whole of Britain. And so what do you think the movement can do to actually develop the class and political consciousness that we so badly need? Thanks, Janet.
I just see Tam Kirby's the only other one. So if I take Tam's question and then get you to answer them, would that be okay?
Yeah.
Tam Kirby?
Sorry, I thought there was somebody before me there. Just a
Well,
few.
Billy did have his hand up, but it disappeared again. So I don't know if he's finished.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to the speakers and especially to Clydebank TUC for organising this very informative meeting. And I'm sitting here in Methil, and it actually resonates today. I mean, we had the BIFAB working, and then if you look at the Harland and Wolff working that happened a couple of years ago or a year and a bit ago, and now BIFAB actually owns 2/3 Harlan Wolff now owns 2/3 of BIFAB. It kind of does resonate with us. And as chair of Fife Trade Union Council, we were involved in that campaign. But it sort of went wider than that. The BIFAB campaign went out and engaged with the public, it went out and engaged with the local community, engaged with the Trades Council, held public meetings, and the other key was it was fully supported by the STUC. And this all added to the strength of the BIFAB campaign. Mary and John both indicated that these types of campaigns cannot succeed without the support of the wider community it's based in. And I think my sort of question is, how do we make sure these campaigns actually move out with the local branch and move wider to actually engage with the communities that any action is going to have an impact on? We have to learn to engage and utilise our local communities in all our worker struggles. We definitely have to strengthen our trade council network here in Scotland, and there has been moves on that, because we have to remember that throughout working class history here in Britain and in Scotland, the trade council network and the trades council movement were key and central to every major campaign that was happening, whether it was across Scotland, across Britain, or even locally. So we need to resurrect that very trade council network. And we have to remember, and it's been stated before, it's not about who owns and controls, it's all about who owns and controls the means of production and who that ownership and control benefits. And the question is, how do we gain control and ownership of the means of production to ensure that we have full employment, to ensure that we have good jobs for our local communities, and to ensure that we're actually building a community-based approach to everything. Thanks.
David, do you want to?
Well, a few things there. The question of women in the working. We actually had women because there was tracers, secretaries, cleaners, and that. As far as our wives were concerned, well, my wife and the stewards' wives were certainly involved, but we didn't have a mass movement of women in it. And one of the things, John, last speaker, I think it's important to understand in the 70s, the shop stewards movements could operate, we could have sympathy strikes, we could do a business. Thatcher put anti-trade union legislation on the statute book, which hasn't been taken off, even though with Labour governments had told that's there. So it's illegal to even have community support of your mate across the road. So the Tories only daft, they'll learn the lessons to stop us breaking out. We've got to build up the trade union movement again for the grassroots. That's the first thing we've got to do. So we've got to get rid of the anti-trade union legislation that's on the books. Now, how you do that with a Tory government, I'm not sure. I'm going to say something there just to cover maybe enough a lot of things and it will shut up. But 50 years ago, if you'd say to me, right, 71, 72, what do you think is going to happen in 50 years' time? And we look about, I've got millionaire public school boys running the country. An unelected House of Commons. We've still got first past the post voting system, which means with 40% of the vote, you can control the country. That's going to be changed. We also have a position, I'm going to have a go at this because I think it's awful important. We have a millionaire in charge of the Labour Party, with a name supposedly after Sir Keir Harvey will be burling in his grave now. We also have in Scotland a millionaire now in charge of the Scottish Labour Party. How do you change a system? We've got millionaires running the country. We've got a millionaire in charge of the British Workers' Party and a millionaire in charge of the branch thing in Scotland. That's good. So the thing is politics, isn't it? We've got to capture the control of the government before you can take on for a lot of things. And I don't know where you start. Somebody's got to come up with that. I don't know if it answers the question. We've got to fight. Anyway, I'll tell you a wee thing about John, just in case it was important. See, when we were in the UCS, part of the thing about alliances, we discovered with a common alliance with a liquidator. Think about that. because it was important that he get his ships out in time at a cost, and we were in alliance with all the small subcontractors because they wanted their money and they needed to get the boots out in time to get their money. So there's things you learn in a struggle that you don't understand. So I haven't got answers, I'll be honest with you, but one of the important things in UCS, from my point of view, I was a staff worker. And just before the Upper Clyde shipbuilding started, the draftsmen and other shipyards were locked out for 6 weeks by the employer, trying to break our union. And we won. And we won. The reason why we won, because the manual workers came out and strike one day to support us. And we learned a lesson. Staff workers and manual workers must hang together, because if you don't hang together, I'll hang you separately. Yeah, I'm not getting the answer. All I know, unity. You can have unity in the graveyard. The only unity you've got is in action against the employers. That includes political action and industrial action together. Specific answers, I do not know. Sorry about it.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, no, some really challenging questions. I guess I'll pick up Tom's point around the Scottish Parliament, and I sort of have to agree with you, Tom. And I was around in 1999, and I do remember the tremendous hope that we had for a Scottish Parliament, and that we did at the time seem to have people elected to Parliament that looked like us, and particularly thinking about the Labour Party and the tremendous 50-50 campaign that Labour actually, and it was trade union women that forced Labour to have that gender balanced approach. So you did get, real people in the Parliament, but, apart from a few exceptions, I do think it's failed to live up to the hope that we had, and particularly over the last couple of weeks, where I just feel it's farcical, in terms of the attempts to hold the government to account for that botched sexual harassment inquiry. And I think it's become far too political, and we've that inquiry hasn't addressed the real issues of why could an employer not run a fair and transparent inquiry into those important issues for women. So yeah, I think that's incredibly depressing, and I think we need to look to the trade union movement and the opportunities that we've got in the next few weeks before the parliamentary elections to be really grilling our candidates, and to be really ensuring that they are responding to the key issues that matter to trade union people. So I totally appreciate that's incredibly challenging, particularly when we see the polls, and it feels like flags matter more than jobs and the economy and health. So it's going to be tough. And then I also wanted to pick up, I think it was Tom's point around political education, and I think that does pick up Tam Kirby's point around building the movement. And I think the one thing about lockdown and the new way of working is, at one point, we had 90 or so people on this call, and I'm not sure how many you would regularly have at Clydebank Town Hall, but it feels we've reached a much wider audience, and the fact that we've had people from Fife and Aberdeen and elsewhere meeting this evening is a real opportunity. And so I think trade unions need to look at how we can use the new ways of organising and working, the social media, the WhatsApp groups, but also, but it isn't just that. It is about talking to workers and families, and really responding to the key issues. And I think the STUC has been trying to do that. Our People's Recovery document is a living document, and we'd really like you to be talking about it in your workplaces, in community groups, because I think that's what's going to make the difference. But I totally accept that we're really up against it when you think about what's playing out in the media at the minute, and it's family, it's not things that matter to us, and I think we have to do all we can to take our issues and promote our issues so that we can make a difference. So thank you.
Before I go to John, can I say that I have noticed there are people from south of the border and Belfast have joined us. You know, so we've gone far afield tonight, John.
Yep, they're very difficult questions, and I think, well, in terms of women's participation, yes, there were, as Davy says, women involved in the workforce, but there are also women involved outside, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the role that they did play in mobilising support. It was important in the local communities in Glasgow and further afield, and that some of the workforces, quite a lot of the workforces that did come out on strike were female workforces. And there was quite a close link, for instance, between the Yard and some of the women employing factories, electronics out in East Kilbride and other places. So there was, again, connections within that movement. But the difficult question, I think, is the one about how we turn things round politically now, the issues raised by Tom Morrison. In some ways, it looks much worse than it was in 1971. But on the other hand, if we look at where what you might call capitalism is at the moment and what it's doing to this country, if you're thinking about monopoly and what it is today, it is far more intense than what it was then. If you think of what has happened in the last year or so in terms of the concentration of retail power in the hands of Amazon, lots of small shops have gone to the wall. Think of the massive companies in IT and the degree to which they are exercising monopoly power. And also remember what's happened in terms of investment in this country, but across the capitalist world, but most intensively in Britain. There has been a collapse in productive investment over the last 10 years, a collapse in innovation. And that is because of the way in which finance capital grips the economy. It's no longer the old style public companies. It's public companies that are controlled by investment management companies that are in competition with each other and have to extract the maximum dividend income out of them in order to survive. And that is where we've got to. And it is slowly crippling and deindustrializing the whole of Europe, with one or two exceptions, but particularly and more than anywhere, Britain. So there is the objective circumstances. It's how we get an understanding of this and recreate that political education that was going on at the time through trade union councils in the 1970s and through the Communist Party and indeed people in the Labour Party in the 1970s. There was that, in a sense, common front understanding at that point, is how that's rebuilt. And we should bear in mind, and not to be too defeatist, it's only 4 years ago that the left did capture control of the Labour Party with a kind of programme that exposed that monopoly control and had a vote of around about 600,000 Labour Party members supporting that position. Now that hasn't gone away entirely, and to some extent the conduct of Sir Keir Starmer has only, I would have thought, reinforced the need for that kind of radical change that the Corbyn movement represented.
Right, Linda, I see your hand up. Just so that you understand, I'm trying to watch screens, I'm trying to watch the chat, and I'm trying to watch the electronic hands as well. So I'll try and get you all. It might not be as quick as you would like. So I've got Linda, then Willie Payton and Anne Field. And I see there's one from Sandra and Sandy Baird, but if I can have Linda, Willie and Anne first.
I just want to make a short contribution, but first I'd like to thank the speakers and thank people for organising this. It's great to be together, although, you know, these kind of venues, they have their limitations, but still. Just over a year ago, towards the end of February, we had in Belfast Neil Gore and people from the Townsend production who were going to put a play on about the UCS, and they were doing a lot of research. And it was very exciting for us because we were sitting in the Shankill Road, Joe Bowers were there, and a number of fellas from the shipyard, and we were talking about, you know, they were talking about their life at that time. And, you know, this is, as somebody said, different media things, and the cultural and the singing and that kind of things that go on, those kind of things that go on are really important. And for us, you know, for us in Belfast to be able to link up across the different shipyards, I think would have been excellent. And I don't know what's happening with that now, but it wouldn't be the same as what it were going to be when we were going to have that play here in Belfast, and maybe we will at some stage. But anyway, thanks very much again.
Cheers, Linda. We're still waiting on it in Clydebank. Right, Wally Payton.
Is waving. Hi, good evening, everybody. Speakers have been wonderful, as you mean. You know, it's great looking back in history, you know, and where we've done well and where we've not done so well. However, that is history. What's happened in the past is entirely different to what we are facing today, you know, in the industries that we have. I mean, I've been on the picket line, and, you know, I was a bus driver when I was younger, and I was on the picket line in deregulation at St Andrews Square in Edinburgh, and getting run over by stagecoach drivers, etc. You know, but it just doesn't happen nowadays. And it's great, you know. I mean, history is a great thing, and it's a great thing to learn from. But what I would really like to start hearing is what we're going to do for the future. I see a lot of us here, you know, on these Zoom meetings, and most of us aren't getting any younger. Well, what I don't see is younger generation coming in. We're not promoting it enough. And we're in such difficult times just now as a country, as a trade union movement. Our density has probably been the lowest it's ever been for decades. You know, we don't have closed shops, we don't have the industry, it's a service industry. Most people that work in retail or whatever, they don't even know what a union is. They think they're in the union. Oh, my boss told me I'm in the union, so I'm all right. You know, so we need to start educating them there. But there was an interesting point, you know, even looking on Facebook, and I've been kind of watching that, the NHS for workers say no. And there was an interesting quote there, and let's go back to before Thatcher stopped us with flying pickets and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, trade unions supporting other industries. You know, you touch us, we'll go on strike. You touch them, we'll go on strike. You know, as it's basically now illegal. But it was a point now, because of COVID and the way the nurses are going to 1%, and there's various arguments going about, yes, they're in highly paid, public paid work, etc. These are educated people. I mean, they've got degrees, but just because they've got a degree doesn't mean that they're any higher, you know, or more intelligent than someone on the till in Morrison's or Tesco or whatever. But the concept was actually said by one of the nurses, saying, we can't go on strike because we are saving you. Would you help us and go on strike for us? Now let's get that concept back. The Tories are coming for us. The Tories are going to privatise our NHS. Whether Scotland's independent or not, we're a part of the United Kingdom, The NHS for the whole of United Kingdom is mandatory for everybody. You know, we need that. The question I'm putting out to everybody, will you go on strike if they touch our NHS again? They're already selling it off in England. We've got a bit of a cushion here in Scotland. However, but the serious question is, will we do it? I'll be on the streets. I'll go to jail for it. I'd be happy to go to jail to protect our NHS. I'm putting the question out there to anybody, everybody here. Would you?
Right. Anne, do you want to put your question and then we'll go back to the speakers? I've put up a list of the ones I've seen. So Anne Field.
Okay, thank you very much, Janet. I'm from London, and I just wanted to make 2 points, actually. First of all, thank you very much for putting this meeting on. I can't tell you what an effect the struggles of the UCS workers had on London trade unionists in the early 70s. And when I first joined the union in 1971, this was at a period, as John and Davy have described, and Mary described so graphically, was a period of great mobilization. And it was a movement, not a monument. And there were a whole bunch of occupations and work-ins. And one of the most successful, although it was short-lived after they got a new owner, was of course the Bryant Colour work-in, printing a work-in dispute in South London. So it was an inspiration, and when I first joined, that was the main topic of conversation, was the UCS work-in, and it was inspirational, it was exciting, and it was infectious because it's workers, other workers organised and standing up and defying government and so on. But as other speakers have said, particularly the last speaker, Willie, we were activists in peacetime. There's a war on now, not a Cold War, but an actual war on workers. And it is so difficult for union reps and union members to stand up, and everything that we can do to help people to stand up, get off their knees and to stand up will help, because all of our antecedents, all of our trade unionists right throughout the whole of the building of our great movement have had to defy the law every few decades or so. And the whole of our history is building up the rights of workers, but also to sustain workers through terrible, terrible hardship. So we have to convey that in some way, but I'm absolutely certain that there are so many workers in struggle at the minute, whether you're talking about transport workers, bus workers, NHS workers, and so on, up and down the length and breadth of the country, that if we stand by these workers and publicize what they're doing and use social media as well as our traditional forms, then eventually people will stand up. But I think what we have to remember is that people who are in survival mode are not the strongest. So the virus and the lockdown period over the last year, it's a miracle that people are struggling even with that background. But I've got every optimism that people will fight again and retrieve our rights. But my main point was thank you for this meeting. You were an inspiration to us, Davy, and the others. Thank you.
Bright colour.
Mary, do you want to start off with a reply to these questions?
So, Davy?
No, Mary.
That's what I thought you said.
Okay, I'll try and be quick because I can see there's still a lot of hands. Yeah, no, I totally take the point that particularly Willie said around the future. All I was going to say that, I mean, we do have some really good, strong trade unionists, and actually some of them spoke about this, and I'd encourage you to all go on, pretty sure it's the Reed Foundation website, because they held a discussion around UCS. I think it was back in January, and a couple of the Unite young shop stewards gave their perspective. So hopefully that can help to show that we do have young people organising. And I know a lot of unions, including my own union, have increased our membership over the last year, and that's a lot of those new members are the younger members, particularly in universities. It's casualised members because I guess because of the circumstances and their appalling work conditions, and they're really looking to us to address them. So I suppose just to give you a bit of hope there. And finally, Anne's point around like survival mode, and I think you're absolutely right, and the concerns around mental health, and I think us as trade unionists have got a real responsibility, not just to be getting our employers to be addressing things like workload, providing support and not overburdening people at this point, but also to be protecting ourselves and to be taking our own advice about getting breaks, getting outside and taking care of ourselves, because we're coming up for a year working like this, some of us, as well as people that, if you haven't been looking at a screen, you've actually been on the front line. So taking care of ourselves as trade unionists has to be a real priority.
David, I'm away. Cheerio. Joe Barr's here. You done well.
How's it going, Joe?
All right. You done well. I have to go, unfortunately. I'm breaking in. Sorry about that.
You're not going for a pint, are you?
That's where I'm going now. Me and David had a good time in Belfast when all this was going on too, didn't we? Watching Ian Paisley and all that, Anyway, all the best. All the best.
Good on you, sir. Good on you.
John, do you want to answer any of the questions?
Well, just to say to Linda, we all hope that play will come on. And I think I noticed that Neil Gore, who's one of the key people in it, is actually on the screen here, might want to come in and say something about it. Willie Payton did pose the key question that we have to face. And I think, as I said, we have to think about the relevance of UCS to what we're doing today. Mary was quite right. The trade union movement is growing. It's grown for the last couple of years, but it's grown very strongly in the last year in education, in transport, and in the NHS, because people see the need for mutual protection in a way that they didn't before. And everything we know about what this government's going to do means that there will be more need for that over the coming period. They're giving out wage increases of an insulting kind at a time when we know inflation, according to the bankers, is going to be up near 3% by the end of the year. So it's going to be a real cut in incomes. And matching that, we can be sure that they're going to claw back what they've been so-called spending to keep the economy running, basically, for those who own the capital. And that means more what will be called fair sacrifice by all austerity, cuts in the social wage. We can be sure that will be coming in. So that is the basis for having to build the solidarity that was talked about by Willie. That's what we need to do. And we need to do it against a background of pointing out the absolutely predatory character of the economic system in which we live today. Just to Anne Field, I thought her statement was really, really very important. And the Bryant Colour occupation was one of those that did both take its inspiration from UCS, but actually had direct support from UCS. And it was speaking to one of the stewards that, in fact, it was Anne who put me in touch with there, Chrissy Brazil, a woman who helped to lead that strike. It was Jimmy Airlie who came down after they'd set up their occupation, which was a year after the UCS began. And it went on for a further year with support from UCS and other workers. So solidarity in the past, but we got to build solidarity now with a political perspective. And I'll come back to it. I think we do still need to have a daily paper, and we still need to have the Morning Star giving us that clarity. That gives us political education every day.
Davy?
Well, just funny, when we were talking there about Brian Colour, I've got the poster. We went down to Brian Colour from UCS, and he printed
That's right. Yeah.
the victory poster.
Yeah.
And as we joined, we supported him. But I think, let me controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. The argument we've got today are winning. It's a political argument. I don't think for a minute the trade unions are strong enough to take on a Tory government. I don't think that's there yet. So what we learned for the UCS is the tactics that worked in the past don't work anymore. I want to find new tactics. It's what you don't fix bayonets and run out of barbed wire and machine guns all the time. You go to sit and think, you don't go and strike, you don't do this. So I'm putting it quite clearly. There isn't a snowball's chance in hell as electing a progressive or a socialist government in Westminster. The only way you're going to beat them is by creating an independent Scotland, as John Maclean said back in the 1920s. Go to beat them, so you've got to come out from underneath them, because we can't beat the British state. So we're going to create our own independent government in Scotland. That doesn't mean an SNP government, by the way, because an independent Scotland, give a communist government, a Tory government, Liberal, you go to change your political parties in Scotland to elect the government you want. And then the Irish and the English and the Welsh, we can show by example how to build a progressive country. A land fit for heroes, as my old grandfather used to say, yeah? When are we going to do it? We've got the lowest pension, state pension in Western Europe, and we can't even change that, even after 10 years of Labour government. So I'm saying quite clearly, break the mould. Let's go for independent Scotland and build a progressive and socialist government in Scotland.
Right. Yeah, I've got another 5 want to ask questions, and I'm really sorry to do this. I'm conscious of the time. So can I ask you to try and keep them as concise as you can? I've got Sandra, Sandy Baird, Jean Ann, Robert Amos, and Neil Gore. So Sandra.
Hi, I'm from Warwickshire. Thank you to the speakers. I've read the history, but it was brilliant to hear personal experiences. I'm a critical care staff nurse, and thank you for showing support for the NHS pay campaign. Is very difficult. Initially, it was grassroots who organised this, and the unions were quite late to embrace this. Regarding organising, you can have the persuasive conversations, but to get people mobilised within a divided workforce, where we have a huge migrant workforce without security of tenure, it is so difficult. It's also very disappointing regarding how can the left win when we have general secretary places coming up, and there are 3 on the left wing platform. Why is there individualism and sectarianism within the left, which is bringing gains to the right? And thanks very much, everybody. Really enjoyed it.
Sandy Baird.
Hi, my point is really that the pandemic really should have created an opportunity for the left here. You can see there's never, it's a historic moment for the economy and the billions of pounds that are being poured in to try and keep things going. This is the perfect time to start from scratch, and yet there doesn't seem to be any coherent plan from the left. Why? I guess why is that? I've seen the only plan I've seen, Commonweal here in Scotland, but it doesn't get much traction in the media. The Labour Party has been characterised very accurately, both the British and Scottish Labour Party so far, and it just seems like this is a chance to build a new vision, like UCS in 1971, a completely radical vision. Now is the chance, because the current situation has been set ablaze by the virus, and yet it doesn't seem to be happening. And you know, a question to Mary, I suppose, the STUC hopefully kind of getting behind such a plan. But yep, that was my point.
Jean-Anne?
Unmute. Hi everybody. First of all, wonderful speakers. Really excited to be part of this tonight, because when I was at school I remembered this all happening, and because I went to school just round the corner from John Brown's. Just wanted to say that I was brought up in a family that trade unionism was really important, and when I went to work I never dreamt of not being a trade union member. I didn't think you could go to work without being in a trade union. And I think that, you know, that mentality has been, you know, the stuffing was kicked out of that when people were put in a position that if they were a member of a trade union, it was a real issue. I, at one point in my life, worked in print. I worked at the Herald and Evening Times, and I was a member of SOGAT. And that was during the time that everything was happening at Wapping. And on payday, the mother of the chapel would go around and she would take 10%. You had to go to the bank at lunchtime and you had to have money for the mother of the chapel to collect. And everybody gave 10% of their take-home pay to the Wapping Fund. And nobody batted an eyelid. You just wouldn't get people doing that now. And in relation to what's happening here and now, I've got 3 children, and all 3 of my children are trade union members, because basically, you know, young people don't naturally think that they have to be a trade union member until something goes wrong. So I think that we have to really target our young people, and I don't mean politically target, I mean in the workplace, and get them to stand up for their workers' rights, because so often they've got 0-hour contracts and they're basically backs to the wall and frightened to say anything, or they'll lose their job because there's a queue of people waiting to take their place. That's all I wanted to say.
John, do you want to start off in replying?
Is it? John?
Is it me?
John Foster.
Okay, sorry. Well, I always try and get at the back so that other people can answer the difficult questions, but I'll come in. Yeah. Yes, Sandra, about the NHS and the fight that goes on there. I think this is just an example of where we are today at the moment. I think Sandy Baird was also eloquent on that. There's a fighting spirit, but there's also a lot of despondency. There's a lack of overall perspective. And it's precisely meetings like this where we've got 80 people at it, a lot from the local community in Clydebank, but a lot coming from elsewhere, a lot coming from trade union councils elsewhere and from trade union movements that are the beginning of starting to redevelop that political culture of solidarity across the country that will enable us to attack what is the most corrupt and cynical government that probably we've had, more incompetent than that of previous Tory governments, and one which is visibly in hoc to the most predatory of the monopoly capitalist firms. And that is what we have to get across, I think. I won't go after Davy about his statement.
I know.
I think we can have a discussion maybe elsewhere. But I think there is still an enormous amount to be won from unity across the nations, and to be the only real lever of solidarity that can attack those who own the capital. And they are centered in the City of London, and they are backed up by a state system that will penetrate all the nations of Britain, even though we might get a notionally independent Scotland independent in the EU, but bound by all the rules and regulations that mean that you have to have neoliberal rules governing your life. I said I wasn't going to get into this discussion, but I have. But I better keep quiet. I better keep quiet. But I think this meeting has shown, leaving that aside, the combativeness that does exist, the beginnings of a new political culture, and we mustn't glorify the past. We mustn't forget that things weren't that brilliant in Glasgow in terms of overall political understanding at the time. I think Davy could maybe come in on this, but remember that there was sectarian conflict in Glasgow of a very serious character in that period, reflecting what was happening across the water, but also impacting on the yards. Now, ultimately, it didn't happen in the way that it could have done, but we shouldn't glorify those times. It wasn't all solidarity. It was a struggle, and it had to be maintained by a relatively small cadre of people with a perspective and an ability to win arguments. That's what we need to get back to.
Davy, do you want to reply?
Well, it's not to be too defeatist. I'll go back to what John said there, and I think it was important. I was working in Bartley Curls shipyard drawing office in the 1950s and made about 100 people working in that drawing office. A wee argument was between apprentices and the journeyman who used to get a vote and all that. But cut a story short, I got elected the chairman of the office committee in Bartley's in 1958, when I was about 18, right? Now, I ended up meeting it. I says, any other business brothers and sisters, the guy says, they've started a Catholic, Davy. I went, what are you talking about? He says, your man here, he's a Catholic. I says, end of story. There was 100 people working at the drawing office and not one Catholic. And that's a problem we had to. So 3 in the afternoon, in the toilet, I had to fight 3 oarsmen. I was a young guy then, the enabler. But the meeting accepted, that was a load of nonsense, and the guy started. But think about that. I'm a flyman for East Glasgow, 18 years of age, and I didn't know the sectarian that was in that drawing office. Fairfield Shipyard, Alaya Road, I'll tell you what happened there. When the boys sat the exam, the senior apprentices marked the exams. And if you came for a school, it had sign in front of it. They threw the exam paper away. Yeah, that was the 1950s. We managed to beat all that as we come through into the 1960s. But so nothing was easy. But once we get into the Fairfield Glasgow experience, started making things easy, because then we could actually get check off. You could take your union money off your wages. You didn't have to collect money. You also could collect money for shop steward funds and things like that. So the organisation started getting better, but it wasn't easy because you still had a position. I'll tell you another story that people don't tell you, but the foreman allocated the overtime. So the overtime, the foreman would go into a pub on a Friday night and get slapped a half or a half crown and a matchbox. So the guys would get 2 nights on Sunday. We stopped all that. So I'm just saying these things happen, but you can organise. And I'm saying, still arguing politically, it's independence, but you still have to argue and get people into trade unions, because a trade union can organise within a workplace and talk, but you need everybody in the union. You've got to convince people. You can't force them, but you've got to convince them. And once you convince them, you start arguing about wages and conditions and other things, you can then move the argument up to somebody you can get like we did and say to your boss, by the way, we've just taken over. And he says, I know. So if the shop stewards committee decides something and you're against it, it's the shop stewards committee that decides, but you keep running the place in a normal way until you disagree with the shop stewards. And he shook hands and says, aye. Yeah, that's what you call moving. You can't start a Catholic to actually taking over a place, but that was a short 10 years. I don't know if it answers any questions. I'm just telling you.
Mary, do you want to make any comment?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I guess just to pick up the sort of sectarianism on the left, and I guess that's a real challenge, isn't it? Because I think the one thing that we see about the right and the Conservatives is they're absolutely united on getting and maintaining power, and they'll do anything to hold on to it. And I think, as you know, as a left, we need to get better at, I suppose, mobilising and inspiring people and getting power and being able to do something that makes a difference for working people when we do that. Because certainly at the minute it feels like it's only trade unions that are holding, you know, this appalling Tory government to account. And I suppose to, you know, echo some of the comments that John said. I mean, this really is an appalling Tory government getting away with so much. You know, I think, you know, 10 years of austerity, which has put in place the terrible conditions that enabled the virus to, you know, devastate even more, and the fact that our public services were so unprepared to help people and to support people for the virus. And you know, I guess opposition's tough, but I really feel we haven't held them to account. And the other area where we haven't held the government to account is over the cronyism and giving out the contracts to their pals. And this is so much worse at Westminster level. The cronyism and the pals of Matt Hancock and the rest of the millionaire elites in the cabinet have just got away with this, and it is so appalling. And whilst I'm obviously delighted that the vaccine rollout is going well in the UK, I just feel that that's enabled them to sort of just focus on that and forget all of the bad stuff and forget this appalling death toll that we have in the UK that clearly did not have to be this way. So, you know, we really need to do more as trade unionists and on the left to hold certainly the Tories to account. And to be frank, when you look at the Scottish death toll, it is as bad. And you know, okay, Nicola Sturgeon's been better at communicating with us, but the experiences of frontline workers in the NHS and the death toll in Scotland is comparable with the UK. So, you know, we haven't done much better there. So that's what I would add, Janet.
Right. Right, okay, two questions left. Robert Amos and Neil Gore. So, Robert, sorry it's taking so long, but I've got to you eventually. You need to unmute yourself, Robert.
Okay, hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just supporting some of the questions that David Torrance and Tom Morrison has been progressing. As a product of the miners' schools in the 80s, where we were able to develop communism and to develop new cadre forces. And there's only other trade unions that I can mind of at that time. It was Ken Gull who was organising political education classes. Now, the difficult we now got is that we didn't have these political education classes. And one of the biggest problems with having these political education classes is the demise of the numbers of trade unions. Now, John Foster has indicated that we've seen an increase over the last year, and it's a welcome increase. But the problem we've got is that up to now, we've got 10 million members of the trade union, a labour force of 30 million. In the 80s, we had 45% membership of the trade unions, the workforce. And that was the key element of the successes of the various struggles for the CS, to the minor strikes in 72 and 74, the strikes for the bricklayers and what have you. But due to the fact that we had mass trade union membership and that we had a strong left that was building broad democratic alliances.
Thanks, Robert. Neil, I see Willie's put up a question that was asked earlier on about people breaking the law to stand up to protect others in another industry or service. So when I get back to you, maybe you can maybe get a comment on it. Neil.
Hello, mine's less of a question, more of a hello, because a couple of people have already mentioned the show that we're doing at Townsend Theatre Productions, which is called Yes UCS, which is it's in development still. I mean, we've been held up obviously by the pandemic. We've been unable to tour since last March, so we put it all back. So just to say that the show is in progress. We've had a research and development phase, which out of which we've produced one film, a short film called There's More to Building Ships, which is available through our website and on YouTube. And we're producing another film based on that, about the Appledore, the situation at Appledore. That film's coming out in a couple of weeks. And the play itself will be out, and in the autumn we'll be doing readings of it, where there'll be a forum where it'll be possible to feedback on the play and discuss how the project is going. And then this time next year we'll be on tour with the show at long last. I can promise you. It's been about 3 years in the making, but we will get there. Just so you know, it is on its way. So please check our website, townsendproductions.org.uk, to catch up on all the information about it. Thank you.
Glad to hear it, Neil. Glad to hear it. Right, I'm going to go back to David, John and Mary, and to answer questions that Robert had and any comments about what Neil was saying. But can I ask you to sum up at the same time, possibly?
Right, okay. Right. Robert,
Right,
I'll go first. Robert, you need to have the show this year, because we're not going to listen next year, I don't think, because we're getting a bit old. But hopefully get in touch with us, and I'll come around up. Any of the guys that are left will be on a good show. What was the other question? I think, not to be defeatist, but we can organise for the grassroots up. And the land was talking about weekend schools. Our union, he was talking about Ken Gill, I was in data. And Ken Gill and their union, we ran weekend schools 2-3 a year, educating people and everything, bringing speakers in. So very, very important to get that education through. And the only people I think can do it is the trade unions, but it's going to be very difficult because the team are up against Norbert Ardane, and I've learned other lessons to how to beat us. So we've got to build the trade union, moving up again. As I said before, if you don't hang together, we'll hang you separately.
Mary?
Thanks, Janet. I guess to answer the question that's in the chat, and obviously I'm a trade union official, so I'm not allowed to break the law. So regrettably, in answering that, I have to follow the law. Otherwise, there's a problem for my my trade union. But to pick up the other comments, and yeah, I mean, I think political education is so vital, and I think it's really helpful that Neil spoke about the play, because I do think arts and culture are a great way to you know, make more people aware of, you know, what happened at UCS, and to learn the lessons, and it's obviously so important to be supporting arts and culture in their own right at the moment, because it's such a sector that has you know, suffered during the pandemic. Indeed, one of the meetings I was in on Monday night was about Jenny Lee, that great Scottish politician who was actually the MP for my hometown in Cannock. And that was also to promote a play about Jenny Lee, which is happening in Fife, and linking up the, you know, with the mining and the working class and the stuff around Jenny Lee. So yeah, so I suppose just to thank Neil, and yeah, I shall certainly go and look at your website. But just to conclude, I suppose to say thank you to Clydebank Trades Council, because I think it's been a really important meeting, and I hope it's just one of many events that's going to take place over the next sort of 18 months as we look back on UCS and learn the lessons and sort of reinvigorate ourselves as a movement too, to fight the battles that we've got right now and that are on the horizon. So and thanks Janet for chairing.
Thanks, Mary. John? John, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think it's a
matter
matter
for years.
it's a matter of realizing where we are and the new environment in which we live, analyzing it realistically. We are in a situation, I think everybody's referred to that, of a unique attack on working people. It's going to become much fiercer over the coming period. It's going to be felt in our communities, in our high streets, by ordinary people who need the social services that will be cut. It's going to be experienced by families who will not have enough money to feed themselves, when food banks will be expanding, and where there is the opportunity of, in a sense, the community wing of the trade union movement to act as it did in the 1920s and 30s in Fife and all the other areas where the trade union councils and trade unions worked much more within the community in building unity. People may not be members of trade unions, but they will see the need to fight. And that, I think, is what we have to take from this meeting. It's great that the Clydebank Trade Union Council should have organized it. We've had so many people here. I think that shows that will to understand, to learn from the past. And there is some political education out there. I should mention that there is Mark's Memorial Library that used to carry on that education in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. It is still there. It's still running courses that cover in any one year several hundred trade unionists and others who want to come along to learn about Marxist economics in the same way as they did on Clydeside back under John Maclean in the 1910s and 1920s. We need to expand that, and we need to win the trade union movement to play the kind of role that Ken Gill made TAS play, or Data as it was then probably, play. And the EU used to do that kind of thing as well. I well remember those schools being organized by Jock Sheriff, and above all the miners, as Rob Amos said. But the materials are there and the challenge is there. And to some extent, capitalism is more exposed and is weaker than it was back in the 1960s and 70s. Much weaker, much more fused in terms of finance capital, and with many, many people who previously would have identified with that system beginning to see what it really is, if there is a focus of opposition. So thanks for the Trades Council in Clydebank. I think it's done a wonderful job in getting this meeting together.
Thank you. Tommy, do you want to say anything?
Hi, Tommy.
No, thanks. You did a grand job, Janet.
A gentleman and a scholar.
I think I get no. I don't. If I said I got the short straw, I didn't really. I'd like to thank Davy, Mary, and John for your contributions. Sean for his technical assistance, been brilliant.
Good.
And of course, all of you for your attendance. I did see, England was well represented, so it was Belfast, and I thank you all for your time. Normally, I would say have a safe journey home. Anyway, take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best.